we're sitting here recording a podcast that, is going to be able to be distributed essentially to people's phones, and it'll be going out doing that through cellular towers and fiber optic cable, which has all been laid out in the last 20, 30 years and continues to be so. And that, I think that's a really interesting story.
Hello, my name is Sebastian James Rose. I'm a historian of technology and empire, primarily working on the Middle East in the late 19th and early 20th century. This podcast is part of an AHRC-funded project titled Coloniality and Communications, British Telecommunications in Mesopotamia in the early 20th century. Hello, I'm here in the studio once again with James Elder, archives professional at BT Archive in London. Hello James, it's a pleasure to have you here in the studio.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So my first question to you is, can you tell me about BT Archives for those who might not be familiar with the archive?
Sure. So the first thing to say is we are part of BT, and BT, as people probably know, is a large telecommunications company. We'll talk a bit later about where it came from, but it's a large telecommunications provider in the UK. We are the corporate archives of that company, but because of BT's history, which again we'll talk more in detail about later, but because of BT's history, we have not only the records of BT, which came into being as a company in 1984, but also all of its predecessors. So we hold archives going back to the 1840s. So we're basically, the shorthand of what we are is probably the main telecommunications archive in the UK. There are other very important ones, like, for example, our sort of cousins at Porthcurno, who have the cable and wireless archive, but we are probably the largest telecommunications archive in the UK.
Brilliant. And how did you end up working for BT Archives? And can you tell me a bit about your background?
Yeah, well, I did a history degree originally, but then I spent a decade or more as a civil servant. I sort of joined what was the civil service fast stream, and worked most of the time at DWP, Department for Work and Pensions, on pensions policy and pensions regulation, and the introduction of workplace pensions for a decade or more. Sort of around 2010 or thereabouts, or a bit before then, I was thinking I wanted to change, and I didn't see myself staying in the civil service forever. So I started thinking about what I wanted to do, had to think about what I liked and my background, and thought that archives could potentially be right for me. So I went off and found some volunteering opportunities. In particular, I volunteered for half a day a week for 2 or 3 years at the Natural History Museum's archive in South Kensington, and I enjoyed that. So eventually, in 2012, basically took what became a year out of work, do a bit of travelling, but then also did an MA at UCL, which is one of the 4 or 5 universities in the UK which has a qualification in archives and records management. So I did that, and came out with an MA, and then after a year, in my first sort of fixed term role I had at Schroders, the formerly Merchant Bank, now just an asset management company, did some really interesting archives and records management work there. Then in 2014, there was an advertisement for a permanent role at BT, and I've been there ever since. Basically, it's really interesting because it's a role that's grown and allowed me to grow with it. For various reasons, we've taken on more things, which have meant that although I've been there now for over 11 years, it's not felt like standing still, because there's been so much development in the archive and development in the role in the time I've been there.
Mm-hmm. And what major changes have you seen in your role and the work in BT Archives in the ways that you might store the material over the period that you've been working there?
Yeah, well,
there quite a while.
When I arrived, my then boss David Hay, who basically is the sort of father of BT Archives, he was hired as the first archivist in the mid-80s. he had already started identifying that we needed to get into digital preservation, and some early work had been done on that. That's come on in the last decade to be sort of quite a significant part of what we do, because obviously we are still the collecting corporate archive for BT as an ongoing business these days. And most records that get generated by BT as a current company are not paper, they're electronic. An awful lot of paper is still generated, but most of the business of the company happens through, Word documents, Excel spreadsheets, all sorts of, PDFs, all sorts of digital material. And we need to be able to take in and look after that and keep it as safe as we do the paper records. So that's one big thing, and that's, we've since more recently hired my colleague Elspeth, who is our lead on that. So taking in and looking after digital records is one thing. On the other hand, we are having to sort of, in terms of prioritising, we're looking at the most vulnerable material, and we identified a few years ago through a survey that some of our most vulnerable holdings were videotape from the 1970s, 1980s, 1990s. All after the sort of 1970s, film production, of which there's always been quite a lot in BT, either directly or through production houses, of training films, corporate films, adverts and so on, that moved from film to videotape. And this wasn't VHS and beta that you sort of get at home. It was the kind of formats like U-matic and 2-inch open reel tape and things, which and later on some quite obscure digital formats, which were always commercially facing formats rather than consumer formats. So they were specialists. There were never that many players to begin with, and now they've been obsolete for 30 years. And so it's extremely vulnerable because of obsolescence. There is a good chance that if we didn't digitise it now, 15 years' time, we will find it prohibitively expensive or impossible. So that's one of the interesting things as well. A lot else has changed, and one of the big things we've got coming up is that we're actually moving fairly soon. We are at the moment in a telephone exchange in Holborn, in central London. And as people may know, because at the moment BT is going through a big process of migrating people off phone lines off the what's called the public switch telephone network, and the generation of equipment System X, which was rolled out in the 1980s and is now coming to end of life. They're migrating people from that for those people who still need landlines, to voice over internet. And when that has happened in a given area, you don't need the telephone exchange anymore. So over the next 5-10 years, most of the telephone exchanges in the UK are closing, and that includes our one. So we've got to move out over the next 2 or 3 years. So that's quite a big forthcoming change, which is going to take up a lot of our time.
Yeah. And at the current location, I assume you've got lots of material, physical papers and material that you've then got to transport, which sounds like a massive task for an archivist. So can you tell me a bit about the history of the archive and what researchers and historians can expect when they visit you?
Yeah, so we've been on this premises in Holborn since the mid-90s, and before that we were a building called Telephone House, which is in sort of Temple area of London. The archive was formed when basically in 1981, the post office, which had been the operator of telecommunications in the UK, was the telecommunications elements of it were split off into British Telecom, initially a public corporation, and then in 1984 that public corporation was privatised. So British Telecom, BT, came into being in 1984 as a private company. There was a decision to split the records of the post office so that the records followed the function effectively, so that BT took on the records that related to telecommunications. There were strong practical reasons to do that because engineers and lawyers and marketing people and whoever would need to refer back to what had been happening before the split. So it made sense to sort of to divide them like that. And initially that was thought of in terms of the sort of operational records, which, as I say, people might be looking at, but it had applied to older records as well. And one of the records managers, the senior records managers in BT in the mid-80s, identified we really need to set up our own archive now that we're separate from the post office. And so in about 1985, 1986, David Hay was hired and it became this new corporate archive. It was always the case that because the records that had come over were records that had been generated in the public sector, they were covered by the Public Records Act, so people had a right to see them. And that was sort of cemented. It was already existed, but the Freedom of Information Act, when that came in, covered those as well, because the Public Records Act and the Freedom of Information Act sort of interact. And so that meant that from the word go, when BT Archives was set up, it needed to be open to the public. So it's always had this dual role that we're doing things, we exist primarily as a resource for the company. We are there to support our colleagues who might be lawyers, engineers, accountants, marketing people, who for various reasons need to look at what the company has done in the past. But we've always been open to the public. So when we moved to Holborn Exchange in the mid-90s, a quite nice I forget, have you been over? Do you know?
I actually haven't been over. No.
But we've got a rather nice public search room. It's a bit odd because you come into a telephone exchange, which by their nature are quite functional buildings. You know, they're not intended to have members of the public coming into them by and large. So you come in a fairly sort of, industrial type area, and then you go up to the third floor, and then you come through to our lovely search room where we've got library shelves because we've got a supporting library. We have the copies of journals and things like that that are usefully kept out there, and nice decorative features like the naval architects' models of the various cable laying ships that the post office used to have. And we have space to, actually we could in theory accommodate sort of 8 to 12 researchers at one time. And back in the 80s and 90s, that might have been the case, but of course with so much more being online these days, we're actually serving most inquiries online, but we do still get people needing to come in to look at records which haven't been digitised. So these days, what you might see, we're open Wednesdays and Thursdays by prior appointment, 10 till 4. And what you'd find if you came in, you might be the only researcher in, but you might find that there'd be other researchers in, and yeah, we will just on the other side of the wall that is our strong room, and so we will just you will have in advance ideally requested what you want, and then we will just bring it out for you and support your inquiry.
And what type of sources are available at the archive? You mentioned some of the older VHSs as one of the transformations that you've seen, but what other sources do you have? So
a lot of it is paper. We have, in terms of giving you an idea of shelving in that we have at Holborn, we have about 3.5 kilometres of shelving, which gives you sort of an approximate idea of our holdings. Quite a large part of that is paper, and a large subset of that is registered files. The post office is a large bureaucracy, government organisation. Up until the mid-90s, in common with other large organisations, large government departments, large companies, tended to have a records registry, which would, when a new subject came along, they would create a file for it, assign a number to that file, and then as new correspondence or things accumulated around that particular subject, then things would get added to the file, and the file would go around the office and stuff like that. And if it's a big subject, these files can end up, with 19 parts to them and huge amounts of stuff. And then eventually, when the subject is dead, or sort of is no longer progressing, the file will get closed, and then it would go through, as part of public records process, a couple of reviews at different times to work out whether it needs to be kept or not. And the subset of them that it needs to be kept forever end up with us. So we've got a lot of these, what we call post files, which are sort of the sort of files which document a lot of the goings on in the post office from the late 19th century to the mid 20th century, decisions being made and the business of the department. So we have a lot of that. We have an entire collection of every phone book ever produced in the UK from 1880 to when they stopped in 2024. We have a huge amount of customer literature. So in theory, we probably haven't got everything, but we have a large proportion, one of every leaflet or poster or instruction manual or notice or anything like that engagement with the public that the post office and then BT ever produced about telephones and telegrams. So, and price lists and all that kind of thing, which gives you a good idea of what the public, the way that the public was engaging with the telecommunications network. That gives you an idea of some of the papers we have. We also have getting on for 500,000 photos. These could be covering engineering subjects, so it might be showing all installations of new equipment and things that were being tested, new models of telephone that were being tested, so it could be shots of all of that. A lot of documenting of buildings and installations, so loads of photos of things like Goonhilly, which was the first satellite Earth station down in Cornwall, or the cable ships. Lots of marketing photos, publicity photos, so events, sort of staged images for use in the press or whatever, all that kind of thing. So huge amounts of and photos of people and meetings and so on. As I say, about 5,000 or 10,000 items of audio-visual material, lots of films and videos. So that, as I say, that could be adverts, safety films, training films, marketing and sales films, documents. We've got a full recording, for example, of the first BT AGM in 1984, which at the time was the largest, quite likely still is, the largest ever AGM in the UK, because it was the sort of it's privatisation that resulted in a lot of small shareholders. And at the first meeting, a lot of them wanted to turn up, so they hired the NEC in Birmingham, and had 7,000 people in attendance, and the meeting went on for 3 hours because anybody could ask questions. It's absolutely extraordinary watching it, and a lot of posters, large format artwork, things which might be artworks, diagrams, maps, things like that. Some objects as well. We generally don't have that many objects because we are an archive, not a museum, but we do have some. All sorts of things. All sorts of types of material, and more recently, digital material.
And building on that, is there a set of sources or a source in particular that you find interesting that's caught your attention recently?
Yeah. I mean, to give just 2 or 3 examples. One, when my early favourite, when I joined, which just because I was really surprised to learn that we had it, is, I don't know if you've ever heard of Robert Fitzroy. He was the captain of the Beagle of HMS Beagle when Charles Darwin did his sort of voyage and went to the Galapagos Islands and so on. He's a fairly extraordinary figure himself, quite a tragic figure in a way, because he was bipolar and eventually committed suicide. But he really was a pioneer of weather forecasting in the UK. And when he that was when they were doing the Beagle expedition, he was keeping meticulous records. He came to the conclusion that if observations could be taken around the country, he could issue storm warnings with a day or two's notice. And this was his key concern. As a naval captain, he was sort of interested in the lives of sailors. And he funded an awful lot of this himself. you'll see still in a lot of seaside fishing towns or villages around the UK, you will see quite often near the jetty or the pier or whatever a thermometer and barometer, and sometimes they mention that it's a Fitzroy barometer. So he sort of set up this network, and then the observations around it. And then there were him and a colleague in the hydrographer's office in the Admiralty in London. He took all the readings, and then they would distribute out again storm warnings. And he actually became much beloved by fishermen as a result, because there were lives saved by people not putting to sea when there was a storm just out of sight over the horizon. Anyway, of course, he relied on the early telegraph network to do this. And we have some correspondence with him, from him and the British and Irish Magnetic Telegraph Company from the 1850s. And because I'd read there's a really good novel called This Thing of Darkness, Harry Thompson, is about Darwin and Fitzroy, and I'd read that not long before I joined BT, and to discover we had some Fitzroy correspondence was lovely. So that's one. Another, which just because it was really good to get it in the public domain, is the war diary, which was kept by Gordon Radley, the head of the Post Office Research Station at Dollis Hill in the Second World War, and this had remained classified. It had a government security classification still, and it hadn't been reviewed for quite a long time. And David Hay, my former boss, just before he retired, that was one of his things that he really wanted to get sorted out before he retired. And he did. He managed in 2019. All the necessary people across government did a page turn on it, reviewed it, and confirmed that it could, apart from some small remaining redactions, be declassified. And then I spent the first part of the COVID lockdown in 2020 going through the scans of that, producing a really nice transcript. And that is now on our at bt.com/history. You will find that, and it's brilliant because the Post Office Research Station did a huge amount of work of great variety in the Second World War. Most famously, Tommy Flowers and colleagues designed and built Colossus, which, depending on your definitions, is either a proto-computer or the first computer, and that was created for the code breakers at Bletchley Park. But they also did a lot of other work, and so that's just a really interesting resource, and it was great to get that into the public domain. And then the last thing is just some of the videos I've been working on recently. That I've been working particularly recently on a lot of sort of business videos from the mid 1980s, which are fascinating because they are from a period when networked computers and the sort of convergence of telecommunications and computing was plain that was the future, and they're doing an awful lot of work on that. So there's a magazine program that was produced for a while for sort of senior people in industry called the Communications Program. And it's really interesting because it's this period, but it's just before the internet. Well, the internet existed, but it's just before the World Wide Web, and it's before the internet becomes a sort of thing that everybody understands. So it's so interesting seeing where they are in about 1986 and where they thought things were going, where they were right, where they were wrong, and just seeing you absolutely on the cusp. It's a fascinating period.
Yeah, those examples are really fascinating, and I think really show the range of source material that you actually have in the archive itself. Can you tell us a bit about some collaborations you have been involved in over the years?
Yeah, we've for quite a long time. We've been part of a consortium that was coordinated by the Science Museum, or Science Museum Group, I should say, because it includes all of its constituent museums, to bid for AHRC collaborative doctoral awards And so we've had a number of successful PhD students coming out of that. Some of the more, they're all notable, but we had 3 that worked together, which we knew as the Dollis Hill 3, who basically were covering the history of the Post Office's research function, which is really interesting, and produced 3 really interesting theses, one of which Jacob Ward's has he developed that into a monograph, which has now been published by MIT Press, I think, which is really interesting. So those were 2 really interesting ones. Another interesting one around the same period, Kareem Maguire did a PhD on hearing loss and the post offices and government more widely, and this is just for the NHS, but their production of equipment for hearing impaired people, customers, and this was particularly in the post First World War period, where you had a lot of servicemen coming back who, because of the prolonged exposure to artillery, had suffered hearing loss, and so it was a really interesting piece of history of technology, history of medicine, crossover kind of, and social history, and that's kind of what Corinne's gone into sort of doing subsequently. We did a really interesting piece as well, because it's not all just PhD students, but we did a really interesting piece of work with Professor Eve Kolpus from Southampton University, which was basically about the experience of children and teens in the 80s and 90s growing up on the telephone. And this was a piece of work which involved a lot of public engagement. There's still a website. It's called Telephonic Youth, and it is still up. And hopefully will stay up, because it's really interesting. There was a lot of kind of oral history and opportunities for people to engage, and we took it on the road and went to Amberley Museum, which has a telecommunications element, and had a really fun weekend talking to people. It was great seeing parents and children together, with the parents sort of explaining to their kids how a rotary dial telephone worked, and explaining that it was concepts like the fact that in the 80s, most households, if they had a telephone, they probably didn't have an extension. They just had the one telephone, which was most likely going to be in the hallway of the house. And calls still, although the price was coming down, in parents' sort of view of it, they would have been thinking both about the immediate cost, but they would have been remembering how much it had cost in the 60s and 70s. And so you get battles around, are you still on that telephone kind of thing? And also, it's not just the cost, it's the fact that you're blocking the line. I want to make a call. And that the teenager on the phone can't get privacy, because they can't take the phone into their bedroom. It's just there on a short cord in the hall. So all of these things are really, really, really interesting. And one last one to talk about is Sarah Jackson, who was one of the BBC New Generation thinkers a few years ago, and she's at Nottingham Trent. I'm not sure if she's still there. I think she is, and she's a academic, also a poet, and she did a really interesting project, and the website has dropped out of my memory of what the name is, but if you were to search on Sarah Jackson telephone, it would come up, and it was around how literature or writing responded to the telephone, and so how it started to appear in literary culture, and so she created a really interesting and really diverse list of a sort of library of either incidental or in sort of central references to the telephone in different kinds of literature, be it sort of quite high literature and literary fiction, or poetry, or because it took nominations, and I suggested a couple, one being Sherlock Holmes, who late on in the Conan Doyle stories gets the telephone, and another one is in Good Omens, the Terry Pratchett and Neil Gaiman book, and this did actually get dramatised in the BBC Amazon dramatisation of that, where there's a sort of chase down a telephone line, effectively. That was a really interesting sort of, say, slightly one of those ones which is on the sort of bridging the gap between art and academia, which was fascinating. So it's great, and we enjoy them, and it's really interesting to see the ways that people engage with the collection and what they can find within it.
And finally, what would you like to see more research on in BT Archive? Is there a specific area or a specific set of sources that you would like to see further explored?
One thing for me is that I would like to see more on the sort of the discussing the nature of the telephone and telegram in public and private, private and public, then private again, hands, and the exploration of the telecom service as a large infrastructure project going through the 19th, 20th, 21st century. There's one of the things that slightly frustrates me. There has been some really good work on this, but maybe not recently. Charles Perry, back in the 80s, wrote a really good monograph called The Victorian Post Office. And back in the 1970s, I think, Geoffrey Keeve wrote a very good book on the electric telegraph. And both of these dealt quite a lot of depth with the nationalisation of the telegraph. And it was an important thing there were large sums of money involved in that nationalisation, and because it went a bit wrong in terms of both the appropriation of funds for it, and it resulted in a scandal, the telegraph scandal, which was a big thing and was a contributory factor to the fall of one of Gladstone's governments, and there were subsequent later problems. It is really striking that if you read general histories of Britain in the Victorian period, like even the sort of, if you like, the more academic ones, like say, I've got a copy at home of the mid-Victorian generation, which is the relevant volume of the Oxford History of England. And those talk about, and it's obviously quite a popular theme in historiography, sort of serious, sort of traditional political history, the nature of the Victorian state and how interventionist it was, and blah blah blah. And they always talk about the Factory Acts and things like that. No mention of the telegraph whatsoever, which I find really peculiar. And it's bad history in a sense, because this is really important, and I would like to see more of that, and then carrying that story into the 20th century, because it is an undertold story, the sort of organisational history of telecommunications in the 19th, 20th, and 21st century, and it's a really interesting one. So I'd like to that's sort of a personal thing. I would like to see that. I would also like to see more. We've had some on it, but I would like to see more on the post office and indeed British Telecom as an employer, because it's always been a large employer. We've had some great stuff, in recent years on this. I think of Helen Glue's work on women in the civil service, which is included. She did quite a lot of work on women in the post office, and Katie Hindmarch Watson did a really interesting book on the Central Telegraph Office in the sort of 1890s, and then in the Edwardian period. But those those sort of stories around the workforce are I think there's more to be gleaned from the records as well. But also, just because we're making it available for the first time, I would like to see people making use of the audio-visual collections that we're increasingly putting online. If you're looking at, say, the history of technology in the 1960s, 70s, 80s, and social history in that period, all of this stuff is there, and it's taking us a great deal of effort to put it online, and it's huge fun doing that, because I think they're really interesting. But I would love to see people doing more with them, because it's a new source that effectively, unless people were recording off air in the 1980s, actually, to be honest, that's only the adverts. A lot of it was stuff that was never intended for broadcast, so you wouldn't capture it. But there's lots of fascinating stories there. But yeah, and the last thing is to sort of understand. I don't know if the story has ever quite been told in a domestic context, particularly the development of the networks. I think that is because it's ongoing. Obviously, at the moment, BT's going through these huge pieces of work, as I say, the migration of people from what we call digital voice, which is the closure of the public switch telephone network, the movement of people who've still got landlines over to a digital telephones, and so on, but also the rollout of fibre to the premises that Openreach, which is a constituent company of BT Group, is doing, with sort of getting people. And hopefully, I'm having mine done today. In fact, they're connecting the fibre up to my flat. All of these, huge, big projects, and similar ones in mobile telephony as well. This is just the latest wave of technology and rollout, which has been hugely important to Britain's society, economy, industry, just everything we do, and the creation of those generations of infrastructure, I think, is a really interesting story, which hasn't been told, if you like, as a story of creating infrastructure networks. We're just actually, funnily enough, on around this week celebrating the 20th anniversary of Openreach, which does a lot of this work, and I think sort of, it doesn't have to be celebratory, but work which investigations which look at these, I think, in a way, in their quiet way, quite heroic stories which go across 150 years of creating successive layers of technology. And there's a tendency, and I understand why, to sort of, if you like, as an academic, to problematize these things and look at them, from a point of view of, I don't know, defense, or in the terms of this project, for example, there's an element, quite rightly, looking at it in terms of empire and things, and that is a really interesting story in itself. But also, that just the sort of how these big industrial, sort of generational projects have done, which basically have, created, we're sitting here recording a podcast that, is going to be able to be distributed essentially to people's phones, and it'll be going out doing that through cellular towers and fibre optic cable, which has all been laid out in the last 20, 30 years and continues to be so. And that, I think that's a really interesting story. So, yeah.
Thank you, James Elder. That was really, really interesting. And thank you for coming to the studio and recording with us.
That's all right, no problem. It was good fun.